Whew. Hello, hope you all are doing well. So, since I was unable to make it down to the actual presentation and did not have a poster, after discussing it a bit with Wes, I decided that I would just do a screen recording talking about what my poster would have discussed and just kind of going over my presentation. So, as a little bit of a background, this project focused on three pretty much main goals. Firstly, I wanted to look at some monthly chemical data that was collected by James E.Coli and see how it compared to EPA and/or NCDEQ metrics. For this particular comparison, I did end up just using EPA standards as they were a little bit easier to track down. Additionally, I used that data and some somewhat recent measurements from other nearby streams in the Catawba Rivershed to kind of just contextualize the regional health of Wilson Creek. So, secondly, working with Dr. Tuberty, I established two E.Coli test sites, one initial site and then another site that was added on afterwards. Then finally, I mapped the bedrock geology and soil of the area. So this was pretty much just achieved by overlaying a map of the Wilson Creek watershed with soil and geologic maps. There was a caveat with that kind of came up, but I'll discuss that in just a few minutes. So, to begin, using data that was collected by James at stair number 2, which, for those who don't know, is centrally located within the gorge, I compared water quality data from April, which was the first data that he sent me, to adjacent waterways. So, something that's important to note with this, some of the adjacent waterways did not have very current data. Some of the data that was collected went back as far as 2020, so that is important to note. However, in both of these examples, Wilson Creek, which is the blue area right here, is considerably healthier than either of the other streams, and on most metrics, which do include ammonitial nitrogen and nitrate, which are shown there, Wilson Creek does score much better. So, however, there is one metric of some concern, which is alkalinity, which is lower than other local streams and lower than EPA recommendations. So, to kind of explain why this is the case, alkalinity is essentially just dissolved calcium carbonate in a waterway. There are a couple ways that it can enter a waterway, however, the primary one would be through bedrock weathering. In areas that have a lot of limestone, which is a carbonate rock, areas, the water will typically be more alkaline because as the water is cutting through that rock, it's eroding it, it's dissolving part of it, and you end up with carbonate and calcium carbonate in the water. This area, however, has a lot of granite and gneiss bedrock, which are both volcanic, igneous metamorphic rocks instead of the sedimentary limestone that can add in a lot of carbonate to the waterway. So instead, you just don't really have that major input. Additionally, sometimes limestone is used for agricultural purposes. However, there's no real agriculture in the Wilson Creek watershed. And as a result of that, you could pretty much end up with a very low alkalinity waterway, which can impact the pH. But overall, the lack of acidic inputs into Wilson Creek mean this isn't really too impactful of a metric. It is just something to pay attention to, and it's not really mentioned in this poster because I did not have the data in time to add it in. But looking at the July measurements, the pH of Wilson Creek was 6.6, which was a pretty dramatic departure from recent measurements, which were more in the 6.9 to 7-ish range, meaning it was 3 to 4 times as acidic as previous months. And the EPA guideline for acidity in a waterway is a pH of 6.5 to 9. So it's definitely approaching it, but it'll be important to just kind of continually monitor that particular metric and understand that the reason why pH does seem to be on the low side and is volatile in this area would be due to the lack of alkaline inputs into the waterway. So, speaking of those kind of EPA comparisons, I also contextualized all applicable metrics that he tested for with EPA standards for freshwater aquatic systems. And just this example right here would be phosphate levels. So on the right, there are two graphs of phosphate shown in April and May. And while this may seem like a pretty large change, as you can see if you look over at the left, there's basically a negligible amount of change when compared to the EPA limit, which is the black line shown right up here for phosphate. So yes, there is some perturbation in this metric, and there is in most of them, but aside from the alkalinity pH issue that I already discussed, pretty much all of the metrics of Wilson Creek are so far below EPA standards that changes within them from a month-to-month basis are negligible, and I would be legitimately shocked if they were to ever reach EPA threshold levels under current conditions. So, moving on, the second thing that I really focused on was E. coli testing. This had never really been done in the area. It had been done in adjacent waterways, and the Catawba Riverkeeper does keep a pretty good record of E. coli levels. With this being in the watershed, I did send all E. coli data over to Grant Buckner, who would have posted it in the swim guide if it had exceeded threshold levels. So, it's kind of a little bit of a disclaimer. We used an extrapolatory testing method here, where you essentially take a 1 milliliter sample and multiply your result by 100 to get the 100 milliliter standard that the state and the EPA use for their concentration of coliform or colony-forming bacteria to be an issue. So that threshold is 200 CFU, and as you can see on these graphs right here, at both of our sites, that never exceeded it. Now this extrapolatory method, it is generally accurate, however, it's not very precise, meaning that if we got 1 in a 1 milliliter sample, that could be anywhere from 1 CFU to 100. 2 could be anywhere from 101 to 200, and so on. Therefore, the state and the Catawba Riverkeeper decided just not to really publish any data that records a negative test due to the imprecision in this general method. However, for our purposes, what we kind of realized was that there's no real E. coli risk in Wilson Creek. The water is very clean. At Site 1, which is shown here in the upper right-hand, or upper left-hand corner, it was sampled from 614 to 726. And as you can see, at most, I found 1 CFU in that 1 milliliter sample, and there were several weeks with none. In Site 2, which was sampled from 712 to 723, or 712 to 82, I again found 1 unit at most. So all this essentially is to say that Wilson Creek is very clean from the E. coli and other fecal coliform perspective, and it's not really anything of concern there. So finally, I looked at some maps of Wilson Creek, mapped the geology and looked at geologic trends, and I did my best to map the soil classification. And I'll be honest, I struggled with this. I'm currently working with Dr. Jeffrey Colby, who's in the Geography and Planning Department and a GIS specialist, to find a shapefile and a better base map of the area, because at best, I could just outline the watershed and attempt to map it, but it's not very useful given that there are over 100 soil subtypes. But back to that in a second. So with the geologic map, generally as you head downstream, the geology shifts from diorite to gneiss to a mix of granite and gneiss. So you may be wondering exactly what this means. So diorite is going to be a pure igneous rock, meaning it was just formed through volcanism. This particular diorite was formed when Grandfather Mountain originated due to tectonic convergence. Basically, two plates or a perturbation in the tectonic plates caused, basically they collided together, pushed upwards under a lot of heat. New rock was formed from solidifying and cooling magma. Gneiss is going to be a metamorphic rock. So it's essentially going to be a rock was heated up through volcanism. It wasn't originally magma, but it was heated up, it was melted, it cooled down, and then it reformed into something different. And that's nice. And then finally, as you head down into the Wilson Creek Gorge area, far downstream section of Wilson Creek, it's going to be a mix of granite and gneiss. I'm honestly not really completely positive what caused that mix of granite and gneiss in that section, rather than more gneiss, which is what I would originally expect. My guess is when Grandfather Mountain formed, that basically igneous activity that formed the diorite, that formed the gneiss, partially reached, but did not reach all of the rocks in the far downstream portion of the gorge, leading to some metamorphism in some rocks that just didn't get melted enough to become a new rock type. So, what I did find from the soil map was that there are over 100 soil subtypes in Wilson Creek, and most common soils are found in steep, well-drained mountainous areas, which, I'll be honest, it's not much, hence me working with Dr. Colby to try and find a better base map that can actually give us some information about rare soil types. But if nothing else, it is interesting, and I will keep you all updated as that project kind of continues. So I'm sorry if this was a little bit rambly, long video about it, but it's pretty much everything I went through over the summer. Generally, Wilson Creek, from a chemical perspective, is very healthy. The pH is something that needs to be paid attention to, but I'm hoping, and it seems likely, that it will rise again up from 6.6, hopefully towards that 7-ish area that had been that it had stayed in. The E.Coli testing that I performed was really an exercise in reassurance. Unless something drastic changes with visitor usage or waste disposal, or potentially erosion in the area, I would not expect there to be any major influx of E. coli or other coliform into the waterway. And finally, the geologic mapping section of this was very successful, and I will keep you all updated if Dr. Colby and I are able to find a better base map for soil maps that leads to some potentially interesting discoveries. Thank you, and appreciate you taking the time to check this out.